Hi, I'm author Stephen McGee, and I wrote Health Forensics and Hypoxia, Mental Illness and Chronic Fatigue. And that's me standing on top of the dome of the world's largest telescopes at the WMKEC Observatory in Hawaii, atop Mauna Kea. So we're going to be talking about the telescopes, and this is a book I wrote called Toxic Altitude, and that's the WMKEC Observatory right there. I'm standing inside of the WMKEC Observatory, that's me, and that's the view. So you get a very nice view from that particular position. So today we're going to be talking about known worker deaths in telescope facilities. So we're on page 66 of the book Toxic Altitude, and we're going to go through it. So one of the things I noticed when I worked in the field, I was doing this health forensics work, I didn't realize that what was actually going on was coming out of these exposures I was getting on top Mauna Kea and other mountains I was working on in professional astronomy. So the problem with this toxic altitude is if you have these very high altitude and high altitude exposures routinely, it can take you into hypoxia, mental illness and chronic fatigue, because that's what is seen in Mauna Kea. So, the staff get very fatigued. They have to take drugs, medical oxygen to survive on top of the mountain. And they're basically treating these conditions. They're treating hypoxia, mental illness and chronic fatigue. And the management team calls that summit brain. So the management team atop Mauna Kea knows this as summit brain. So there I am. I've got summit brain up at the top of Mauna Kea. So let's talk about the known worker deaths in high altitude astronomy. So I've actually worked at a number of high altitude facilities around the world, and I only really know what is going on in those facilities, and my knowledge is not that good in the three facilities I worked at, but I do have some knowledge, and we're going to go through that little bit of knowledge I have, which is in this book. So the first telescope I worked at was the Isaac Newton group of telescopes in La Palma, Spain, Europe. And there's some interesting deaths in that telescope. So we're going to start with Tony Farrington. He appeared to die in 1987, and he fatally crashed his car in La Palma. So what makes me very suspicious about this guy is something that was happening to me in my 40s, and that was I was falling asleep while driving my car. Now, that was coming out of sleep apnea. So people that work at high altitudes, very high altitudes, are known to develop sleep apnea. So if I was falling asleep in my car while driving, then I do wonder about Tony Farrington, whether he was falling asleep in his car while he was driving. But the only thing we seem to know about Tony Farrington is he was found dead in a crashed car in La Palma. So he was working at the Isaac Newton group of telescopes there. So the next guy is Dr. Patrick Brendan Byrne, a research astronomer at Amar University Observatory, I should say. Now, he was observing at the Isaac Newton telescope. He developed a sudden illness that killed him at age 49. So I know a little bit more about this story. I'm not going to go into it. I'm going to let you look into this guy and see what you can find out about him. But basically, he died very quickly, and he was at altitude, and he was getting evacuated from what I understand, and he died at the hospital. So the next guy is a guy called Charles Benneker. So he was an Isaac Newton telescope electronics engineer, and the belief is he died from cancer. And I used to work with him. I actually had the office next door to him when I worked at the telescope. So he spent a lot of time at high altitude at the telescopes, and yeah, he didn't live to old age, unfortunately. And he's not the youngest person to have died up there. This lady appears to be the youngest person that has died at the Isaac Newton telescope. So Rebecca Galera, she was a support astronomer, and she seemed to die after the onset of a sudden illness. She's quite recent, 2020 is when she died. It wasn't COVID-19. I know a little bit more about the story, but it's rumours, so I can't really speculate on what this illness was. So I have no definite information on what her illness was. It's just that it was very similar to this guy, this Dr. Patrick Brendan Byrne. It was a sudden illness, and it seemed to kill her very quickly. And she was very young. You know, she's a young lady, and yeah, very unfortunate. So when I was looking into this, I worked at the Isaac Newton telescope. That's where my office was. All these deaths seem to be related. Certainly, I'm not sure about this guy, but certainly some of the others seem to be concentrated at the particular telescope that is known as the Isaac Newton telescope. And in this book, I asked the question, is the Isaac Newton telescope a serial killer for that reason? So there's just something strange that these people seem to be associated with the Isaac Newton telescope. And it used to be in operation as a cell phone tower when I worked there. And it is also believed to be in operation as a Faraday cage. So something strange is possibly going on in the Isaac Newton telescope. And it's probably some form of sick building syndrome. So there are more deaths I am aware of in people that have worked at the La Palma Observatory. So we're going to talk about some of the other people that have died there. So we got Emilios Halafidis. I hope I pronounced that right. He didn't actually die at the telescopes. He died in an avalanche while he was skiing. He was working at the La Palma Observatory. Now, you're probably thinking, what does skiing have to do with observatory workers? It's a very good question. So what happens with these observatory workers is this hypoxia brings on mental illness and chronic fatigue. So these are people that are routinely in a hypoxic state that work at these observatories. And they develop memory problems. So they start making mistakes. So it's kind of something you don't want in a skier. You don't want a skier that is making mistakes. So I don't know what the circumstances were around this guy's accident, except for he was working at the La Palma Observatory and he died while he was skiing. And skiing is generally a high altitude activity, so they're generally hypoxic when they're skiing. So that adds to the issues that hypoxia can cause, such as forgetfulness and making bad decisions. So I kind of wonder whether this guy, we can only speculate because he's not here to tell us the story, but we can only speculate that maybe he was making bad decisions, and maybe that was coming out of hypoxic memory problems that he may or may not have had. So let's move on to the next guy, Hugo Schwartz. I'm not actually sure whether I know this guy. I may have actually met him in the past. I don't really recall him. He worked in La Palma, but he actually died in La Serena, Chile. And it appears he died in some kind of motorcycle crash. So again, we're getting into the same kind of scenario that we discussed with Emilio. and that is, this guy may have had some of this hypoxia, mental illness, and chronic fatigue going on that occurs in high altitude workers. And perhaps his mental functioning wasn't there. Maybe he was forgetful, maybe he was falling asleep from sleep apnea, maybe he fell asleep and crashed. I don't know the circumstances of this particular crash, but he did die. So he used to be the director of the Nordic Optical Telescope in La Palma. And there's another guy. So this is a much more definite accident. This is a workplace accident. So Florian Gobel. So he was the manager of the Magic 2 telescope in La Palma. It's now called Magic Florian Gobel Telescopes in honor of him. He died while he was changing out a telescope lens and fell 33 feet from the telescope to his death. So one of the things to be aware of is these world-class telescopes, these professional astronomy telescopes, they tend to be very big. And there's definite fall hazards associated with these telescopes. So this guy actually fell to his death. So I had a similar experience at the WM Keck Observatory. Obviously I didn't fall to my death, but I came close to falling off the platform, which was about the same height. So had I fallen off the platform, I probably would have died. So I tripped on some rails that were in the floor. They're like train tracks at the Keck Observatory, and pretty easy to trip on. I tripped on them and I almost went off the platform. So there was no guards to prevent me from going off the platform. They have rails, but the spacing on the rails is massive and you can fall through that spacing. So let's carry on down. So here we go, we've got the WM Keck Observatory in Hawaii. So the WM Keck Observatory in Hawaii informs Summit staff they will develop Summit Brain and directs them to date the company supplied drugs and medical oxygen. This worker deaths list is taken from the film credits of the Impossible Telescope. So there's a whole bunch of workers here that the Keck Observatory is aware have died at the Keck Observatory. They kind of either, I want to rephrase that these are workers that have died, but not necessarily at work. So they're just people that have worked at the Keck Observatory and have gone on to die. So I know some of these people. I've worked with them, and probably know about half the people on this list directly interacted with them. And I have some suspicions about some of them. And I was good friends with Maurice No, and Cheryl Baker, Richard Cohen, Ryan Demoda, let's see, Bob Mosquitis, Jerry Nelson, Buff Willard, yeah. So I know all these, quite a few of the people on this list. So quite a few of them have gone on to die, and I have to speculate how much hypoxia, mental illness, and chronic fatigue played into their deaths, particularly because it causes sleep apnea. So you can end up after working at these facilities, you can end up very forgetful. That's kind of what I was struggling with, a lot of forgetfulness, a lot of confusion. So when you become forgetful and confused, it can bring on a much higher risk of accidents. So yeah, it's kind of, you got to kind of wonder what happened to these people. The other thing that when you're exhibiting forgetfulness and confusion is you're probably going to end up on drugs if you start telling the doctor about it. They're probably going to be very potent brain drugs. So you may end up on some like very nasty antidepressant kind of drugs with this hypoxia, mental illness, and chronic fatigue symptoms that you get from high altitude astronomy. So I can't comment about any drugs or treatments that these people were taking, but they most certainly have died according to the Keck Observatory. So you can actually watch an interesting movie regarding the Keck Observatory. It's called the Impossible Telescope, and at the end, in the film credits, you'll see this list come up. The movie's quite interesting. So, I worked at the MGM Observatory, Kitt Peak National Observatory, and have not kept in touch with anybody there, so I don't really know what's going on there, other than I was reporting behavioural problems in workers at this facility to the management team, and the management team said I also had behavioural problems. So the management team knew every worker at this facility had behavioural issues. So I'm not sure whether these people are still alive that I worked with, or whether they've died. I really don't know what's going on with them. So, regarding Kitt Peak National Observatory, this guy, Mark Arnold Aronson, is actually a very famous guy in the astronomy community. And he is famous because he's dead. And the reason why he's famous in astronomy is he was crushed to death by a telescope dome. It was a gruesome accident, absolutely gruesome accident. I am so glad that I wasn't there to witness it, because his head got crushed between a telescope dome slamming a door onto it. It must have been an absolutely horrible sight to see. So, yeah, that was very unfortunate. So apparently that happened in 1987. So if you Google his name, search it on the internet, Mark Arnold Aronson, you'll find some articles about him, and it's all about how he died, and it was nasty. Okay, so moving away from the telescopes, we're actually going to talk about tourists. So tourists actually die at these telescope facilities, typically on the roads to the facilities, because the roads are typically very dangerous to these facilities. So there's a couple of accidents, a few accidents documented in this book regarding Mauna Kea, and this one's a brake failure. So it killed a child and injured 7. There's a Mauna Kea fatality, and a skeleton found at Kitt Peak. So this car apparently left the road, went off, and was hidden for many years, and when it was found, they found a skeleton behind the wheel. So they've been dead a long time. So some of these roads are actually listed as dangerous roads, and Rocky de los Muchachos has that designation, as does Mauna Kea in Hawaii, and Sella Road in Hawaii. And it seems that maybe Kitt Peak is on there too. So I actually lost control of a car on Kitt Peak, and it was in the snow, and I honestly thought I was going to go off the road, and there was no guardrails to stop me from going off the road. So it's very, very dangerous when you get caught up there in snow or ice, or in whiteout conditions where you can't see the edge of the road. So yeah, they're kind of scary in bad weather, these roads, and they can really cause you to have a nasty accident to the point of killing you. So catastrophic failures known to occur in professional astronomy. So we're talking about the Arecibo telescope here. So the Arecibo telescope, most people will know it as that big radio telescope that collapsed. It was on the news a lot. So the interesting thing was, I was looking into it after the accident, and I actually found out that they knew the failing support cables that were supporting the telescope that snapped, causing the accident. They'd known for years that those cables were failing and strands were breaking in the cables, and there's actually people on video. You can go onto YouTube and find videos, and people are getting tours of the platform, and they're standing on the platform that the cables support, and they're talking about how the cables are failing, how cable strands are failing, and they seem to be oblivious of the danger that they're in, standing on the very platform that is supported by failing cables. So it's kind of how health and safety works in astronomy. It's kind of There's very questionable health and safety practices going on in high altitude astronomy. And we finish off with some professional astronomy telescopes are associated with unusual illnesses and deaths in the workers. So that's the conclusion I came to when I was researching my own health issues, which resulted in this book, Hypoxia, Mental Illness and Chronic Fatigue, is that you will develop strange health issues from toxic altitude exposures, and it's very much person dependent. So it doesn't affect everybody in the same way. It tends to be milder to more extreme. It really depends on the person and what they've been doing, what job they've been doing, how much time they've spent on the mountain. So my general feeling about these deaths is the more time you spend on the mountain in a state of what they call summit brain, the more likely it is that you may have a premature death. So that's just my gut feeling, having looked into deaths on the mountain and after the mountain. So these effects follow you. So even after leaving the mountain, as I found, these conditions progressed with age. So after I'd had the toxic exposures, the toxic altitude exposures, this hypoxia, mental illness and chronic fatigue just slowly progressed over years to the point of becoming a disabling illness. So that's toxic altitude and deaths in workers. I hope you enjoyed the presentation. Please like the video. Please subscribe to the channel. And I wish you the very best of health. Thank you.